Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. On Sunday, President Joe Biden announced that he is pardoning his son Hunter, who was facing sentencing this month for federal tax and gun charges. This announcement marks a reversal from President Biden's former promises that he would not pardon his son. Here to explain exactly what is going on is Julia Jayne. She's a white collar criminal defense lawyer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Julia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start broadly. What is this pardon and what exactly does it involve and what does it mean?
Right. So let's just start with the charges themselves. As you mentioned, Hunter Biden was scheduled to be sentenced for two separate federal offenses this month. One of them was the tax offenses, and the other was making a misrepresentation on a form pertaining to purchasing a firearm. So in one of those, he was convicted at trial. The other, he pled guilty to. So Biden's pardon means that it's completely wipes the slate clean. He will not be sentenced. He will not be a felon. It provides complete immunity from all of that. And there was an additional clause, as I understand it, to that particular pardon that states that basically for the last 10 years, he's exempt or pardoned from all other offenses that may or may not have been charged formally.
So it's effectively retroactive for the past decade. It wipes the slate entirely clean.
Yes, I think the language was any offense that he has committed or may have committed or taken part in between January 1st, 2014 and December 1st, 2024.
What is the significance of that 10 years? Is that a common part of presidential pardons, or is President Biden trying to get ahead of future legal issues?
Well, it is not common. And looking back on history, I think the closest that we see in terms of prospective pardons is when in 1974, then President Gerald Ford issued a pardon to former President Richard Nixon, who resigned under the Watergate scandal. The pardon was issued before any prosecution of Nixon had taken place. And that was a shorter period of time. This, as you have just stated, appears to be forward looking in terms of what the Trump administration may or may not do. The January 1st, 2014 date, I don't believe is coincidental. It overlaps with Biden's alleged involvement in Burisma. And so that may be the reason why he has that time period. And I think it is a bit unusual and probably what's getting the most criticism in terms of public opinion on the entire pardon.
So, is it fair to characterize this as an unprecedented pardon? Because you mentioned that going back in history, the Ford pardon of Nixon, there had been no prosecution at that point. But this feels very different.
In modern times, it doesn't appear there have been similar pardons. So it is unique, I think, in that sense. And there are so many political matters surrounding that in terms of what I anticipate Biden is imagining Trump might pursue, as he stated very publicly, going after his enemies, etc. It seems that he really wanted to protect his son from any future investigations, prosecutions into, of course, this any alleged past conduct. Of course, there are no other pending, in as far as the public knows, investigations or prosecutions at this moment. So the way it's phrased as any potential, I think we all have to see how that actually plays out if there's any such pursuit.
As you get into the particulars of what this pardon means, I'm curious, could Hunter Biden invoke his Fifth Amendment rights in any state or federal proceedings going forward?
So, with respect to federal proceedings, the pardon power of the president only applies to federal prosecutions, not any state charges. And also, as we know, he wasn't facing any state charges. The tax charges were federal, the gun charge was a federal form. So, to the extent that he were to ever be asked to testify on any federal matter, and again, if we include the last 10 years of any potential misconduct, arguably he no longer has a Fifth Amendment right because you can only assert the Fifth Amendment if you are facing criminal charges, the potential criminal charges that is a reality. But for Hunter Biden, arguably that no longer exists. So he can't say, well, I'm afraid of being prosecuted because he's already been pardoned. It doesn't apply to state level charges. So maybe that would be a workaround, but it may have really undercut any ability for him to assert the Fifth Amendment in the future.
So, hypothetically speaking, Hunter Biden could in the future be prosecuted under state proceedings and then not be able to invoke his Fifth Amendment right in those proceedings?
Well, if he were prosecuted under state proceedings, um, of course he would have the Fifth Amendment right. It would be a whole new charge. It's difficult to imagine what that might be in what state, on what level. But if he were to be, for example, something within the statute of limitation, a particular state agency, a state prosecutor's office were to bring charges against him, none of what we've heard or what's happened would cover that. He would have a Fifth Amendment right. He would not be exempt from that prosecution. For example, if he had committed a DUI last week, let's say, this would not cover that whatsoever.
This might be a very basic question, but as someone who is not a lawyer, I'm curious about what this pardon means about the actual crimes Hunter is being pardoned for. Does this create any sort of legal precedent in terms of tax law, gun law, and how regular citizens interact with the law, and how law enforcement might interact with regular citizens when it comes to potential breaches in the law on tax and gun matters because there was a presidential pardon, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because those particular charges are indeed criminal offenses. Uh, as we know, he even pled guilty the uh, to the uh, to the tax charges. So while it's interesting because one of the reasons that Biden gave for pardoning his son is that his argument was this was an overreach and many individuals wouldn't even be prosecuted for this. So, not every technical crime that is committed necessarily gets prosecuted. Sometimes things are worked out. Sometimes for example, a tax offense could potentially just be handled within the administrative agency. Are these every time, every single form examined to make sure that, oh, you claim that you don't have a drug problem, you have a drug problem, we're going to prosecute you under this, purchasing a firearm. The argument by Biden was that, in fact, his son was especially targeted because of who he was. This prosecution would have never been brought against an ordinary citizen. So it's sort of twofold. One, would this really have brought against an ordinary citizen? But nonetheless, the pardon typically doesn't excuse conduct. We've seen every president issue pardons, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the nature of the offense itself. It doesn't suggest people are pardoned for drug offenses all the time. Maybe the sentencing was too harsh, but it doesn't necessarily indicate, oh, now everybody can, sell drugs and it's fine. So I don't think it's a reflection of the crimes themselves. It's just it was quite particular, I think, on the form, on the felony, gun form. And I don't know how closely the government scrutinizes every single person who applies for a firearm, whether they've had a drug problem, not had a drug problem. So that was, I think, what triggered the pardon itself. In that, at least according to President Biden, was that this was a targeted prosecution to begin with.
As you look at what President Biden said about this pardon, is there anything in his words or actions that creates precedent for future presidents here? Is he setting a new standard for how presidents issue pardons?
Well, the issue is it might have been accepted um, in the public eye a little more. It might have been a little more palatable if he had not previously said that he would not do so. I think that was a huge mistake to state that he would not pardon his son, and then he did so. But as far as precedent, well, that gets a bit political because Democrats, are concerned with what Trump will do with the pardon power, and essentially, they've been taken down a bit off their soapbox by the argument that this was political by Biden, that this was a political act, this wasn't in the public interest. And so any future pardons by Trump or other presidents I think this lowers the bar a little bit because it is a family member, which is not unusual, and many people can actually understand why a father would want to pardon his son, but it's so political in the present moment that it certainly might come back to bite at least the Democrat.
I was going to ask, is this a sign that presidential families are effectively immune from the law?
Well, um, I don't think it should be that way, but it's hard to imagine, what president wouldn't want to pardon, at least if they have a decent relationship with their child, what president wouldn't want to? So it's a unique situation in that it exists, but if that were to have played in the past or in the future, I think we would see that kind of pardon in a event. In fact, when I was quite surprised when he was so bold about saying he wouldn't pardon his own son. You sort of think, well, look, you have this power to prevent your son from going to prison. It seems like he's really paid the price for not a violent crime. Something that again could have been handled a different way. That there was a plea agreement on the table. Was that plea agreement unfairly withdrawn or unfair to begin with? But as far as family members, mm, some might see it as a blanket, immunity for wrongdoing in the future, although one would hope that's not the case.
Is there anything else about this pardon or Hunter Biden's case as a whole that speaks to you or is especially interesting right now to you as a white collar criminal defense attorney?
Yeah, I think it's more about what will happen in the next administration and how this will be used or misused to pursue future pardon powers. We saw, Jack Smith withdraw several of his prosecutions in anticipation that Trump would have pardoned himself. I mean, that probably would have been more unique than anything in history we've seen a president pardoning himself. That likely would have happened. Um, but again, it only applies to federal charges nonetheless. But it's a lesson, I think, to future presidents not to speak too soon about what you may or may not do in the future, because otherwise, I think everyone would have anticipated a father would pardon his son. But now it's just been made so political, and it's really become perhaps more than it should have been.
Julia Jayne, white collar criminal defense attorney in the Bay Area. Thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time and your insight on these legal matters.
Thank you for having me.